How good is Ditto and Mr. Mime in Pokemon Sleep? In recent times, they've had a change to their main skill, now known as Skill Copy. Skill Copy copies the skill of a random Pokemon on your team. So how do we value something that is random? Is the skill rate of Ditto or Mr. Mime good enough to actually make them kind of dual specialists? Dual in the sense that it would both be a skill specialist and an ingredient specialist. And why are we talking about this now? Welcome back to another Pokemon Sleep video. It's Bro Vinny here. The reason now is a good time to bring up Mr. Mime is because, well, the psychic event is just around the corner. Do I want to catch a good Mr. Mime? Do I want to prepare my psychic Pokemon for the next event, that is Cresselia versus Darkrai, which would use more psychic types? Back at the start of the game, Mr. Mime was kinda crap because as an ingredient specialist that specializes in either tomato or potato, it was completely beat by Victory Bell. At the time, it had Charge Strength S as a skill, but for an ingredient specialist, no one's ever really going to invest 5 main seeds in a Mr. Mime to make use of its skill. But then sometime later, the developers changed its main skill to a skill now called Mimic Skill Copy. And Ditto similarly had a change in its main skill from Charge Strength S to Transform Skill Copy. Now, it is my understanding that both skills are exactly the same, both Mimic and Transform. The difference is in the animation. So the actual skill we're talking about today is Skill Copy. Occasionally, the name in front of the brackets does create a modifier to the skill itself, but in this case, I'm not aware that there's any modifier between Mr. Mime and Ditto's main skill, even though they have slightly different names. Now, in my opinion, this skill change is actually relevant. It is actually significant. The question still remains though, should you invest your main seeds and should you even bother trying to catch a Mr. Mime in preparation for the psychic event or just for general use? Or if you already have one to begin with, so for example myself, I've got a Mono Tomato Mr. Mime, should I raise it? Before we dive into the comparisons and the meta relevance, we need to first cover all the general knowledge about this skill. How does it work and what are its limitations? First of all, Skill Copy does not ever copy the Pokemon itself. For example, Mimic cannot mimic itself. But if there is another Pokemon on the team that also has Skill Copy as a main skill, what then happens is it's automatically changed to Charge Strength S. And this was proven by DoIQTS. I don't actually know how to pronounce your name, I apologize. But what happens is when you have multiple Ditto or Mr. Mime on the team and they manage to copy themselves, the message that you get is that Transform or Skill Copy has failed and the game reverts to giving you a Charge Strength instead. And the Charge Strength amount is the fixed Charge Strength amount, not the variable Charge Strength amount. And I have to agree with this statement is that if you have a whole team of Skill Copy Pokemon, that would be a really bad idea because generally speaking, it's not Charge Strength S that you want to copy. Since the skill trigger rate of Skill Copy is based on Mr. Mime or Ditto themselves, it's better if the skill that's being copied is stronger, even if normally it would have a lower trigger rate on the other Pokemon. Let me phrase that again. If we compare Golduck and Ampharos, you should know by now that Golduck is actually generally stronger as long as you collect every trigger, even though Golduck is a Charge Strength S Pokemon. It has a lower strength, but the thing about Golduck is that it triggers a lot very frequently, whereas Ampharos triggers slower but each time provides you with more. The thing about Skill Copy though is that it ignores all of your Golduck or Ampharos or other Pokemon's frequency, uses its own trigger rate, its own frequency to determine how frequently a skill is to be triggered. So theoretically, if there were skills that have very low trigger rates but are otherwise very powerful, if Skill Copy itself has a higher trigger rate than those Pokemon that harbor those skills, then Skill Copy is meta. It is beneficial to have Skill Copy on the team. We certainly don't want multiple Skill Copy because we don't want them copying each other because that just gives you Charge Strength S, which is probably the skill you don't want, when you could be copying Charge Strength M or other more powerful skills which otherwise have lower trigger rates. So this is a rather important point, is not to use multiple skill copy on the same team unless for other reasons you need them. So you need Ditto's ingredients, you need Mr. Mime's ingredients, then by all means. But otherwise, avoid this situation if you can. So the next question is, well, what are some of the most powerful skills, or rather the lowest trigger rate skills there are in the game? Well, there's Helper Boost, which has probably one of the lowest skill trigger rate in the game because it's otherwise a powerful skill in the right situations. So the question is, well, can Ditto copy Helper Boost? So Doe IQTS has gone through and checked everything. You can copy every skill in this game except skill copy itself. So this animation here proves that yes, you can copy a Helper Boost skill as well. It can even trigger Metronome. So here, this one was verified by myself. Ditto transformed into Togetic and triggered Metronome that then triggered Cooking Power Up S. And just some more general knowledge, if skill trigger triggered on stockpile, the skill is automatically spit up, it doesn't actually stockpile. So currently that's Drifloon's unique skill. So once again, this is not the situation we want for stockpile. We don't want a weak version of a skill. So using stockpile or charge strength S on a team with skill copy, generally not a good idea. Once again, that's given that everything else is the same. So I'm just trying to understand skill copy in isolation, when is it a good time to use? So if you haven't already noticed, there's actually one other difference between skill copy and Metronome. It appears that Metronome can copy skill modifiers, whereas skill copy cannot. So here we have a Mr. Mime who triggered skill copy. It copied Togekiss's Metronome, which then triggered Moonlight Charge Energy S. As you can see, Mr. Mime itself healed 6 energy, but then another Pokemon on the team healed 6. This is unique to Moonlight. And in case you don't understand what I mean by modifier, because we haven't actually discussed this on video before, skills that have brackets, the name in the front is the modifier. The name within the bracket is the skill. I know it's a bit confusing, but in essence, the actual skill being triggered is one of these, like Berry Burst, Charge Strength S, Charge Energy S, or Skill Copy. The modifier tells us that they triggered this skill with something special. In Transform or Mimic's case, it's the animation that's special. In Disguise case, it has the chance of having a great success. In Moonlight's case, it has a chance to trigger the heal on an additional Pokemon on the team. In Stockpile's case, it can hold that charge strength and make it stronger the next time it stockpiles until it spits up. So once again, skill copy doesn't seem to copy the modifier of a Pokemon, only what's within the actual skill within the brackets, whereas Metronome can. So the only time skill copy has been seen to trigger the full skill including the modifier is via Metronome. So let's say Ditto uses skill copy, uses Metronome, Metronome then triggers Moonlight. And in that situation, you can see skill copy use the entire skill, including the modifier. So how should we actually numerically value skill copy? Let's start with the skill we just talked about, Helper Boost, to see if Mr. Mime or Ditto can improve on that skill. So I'm in the Pokedex section of the Raininex calculator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on skill copy of Mimic and Transform. What I'm trying to determine here is who is the best skill copy so that we can use that as our benchmark. And lo and behold, Mr. Mime is actually better than Ditto at skill copy by almost 1 whole trigger per day. So while we will consider Ditto in this analysis, Mr. Mime is actually the current king of this skill. For simplicity, I'm going to remove Transform so that we have less to look at, and then focus on Mr. Mime as it's the best at this skill. And then I'm going to turn on Helper Boost and filter for these 2 Pokemon, and look at this. None of the legendary Pokemon, the only ones that have Helper Boost, match Mr. Mime in their skill trigger rate. So that means if you run a team of 4 legendary Pokemon, which is not possible, you can only have 1 at a time, but to make a fair comparison, we have to make this thought experiment. Theoretically, if I had 4 Suicune on the team, and then 1 Mr. Mime, the question is, does Mr. Mime overall trigger more of Helper Boost than if it were 5 Suicune on the team? And yeah, it does. And that's besides the fact that it isn't even a skill specialist. So you can see that just talking about Helper Boost itself already makes Mr. Mime shine. So let's be more practical. Let's not run 4 Suicune. Let's run 1 Suicune. Having Mr. Mime on the team still improves on Suicune that 1 in 4 times it triggers on Suicune. Of course, does this really work practically, because Helper Boost is often used to overstack the week before an event, rather than itself being used week to week? Well, it wouldn't make as much sense, because then you lose 2 spots on the team for overstacking your berries, as opposed to just 1 when you use only Suicune. So besides overstacking, I'm not saying Suicune is better than running a berry specialist or an ingredient specialist day to day. But if you do use a Suicune in the team, then Mr. Mime improves on Suicune. Now, take a look at Ditto. It actually falls a bit below the legendaries in the skill triggers per day. So Ditto doesn't improve on Helper Boost. But again, don't forget that these 2 skill copy Pokemon aren't even skill specialists to begin with. You're farming their ingredients at the same time. So in fact, to be fair, we actually should be comparing to non-skill specialists for the same skill, so that we can be fair to Mr. Mime and Ditto in their skill output. Which is what most of the remaining of this video is going to be about. The reason why I didn't do this for Helper Boost is because there's no berry or ingredient specialist that does Helper Boost. Only skill specialists do Helper Boost. And just like we did for Helper Boost, we're going to look at each skill and assume that there's going to be 4 Pokemon of that skill and then 1 of Mr. Mime to see if Mr. Mime improves on that skill in a team. We want to know if Mr. Mime is the best or better than other Pokemon at triggering their own main skills. So we're going to look at each main skill one by one. We're pretty much going to go through everything on this list here, starting with Charge Strength S. Again, Charge Strength S is a relatively bad idea when you could be triggering Charge Strength M at the same skill rate. But let's take a look anyway, just for comparison's sake. Here is the list of Charge Strength S Pokemon, with Golduck being right at the top. Mr. Mime not even producing half the amount of Golduck's productions, which makes sense because, well, Golduck's always been known as super high in skill trigger rate to make up for the lack of the strength in its skill. So it's a bad idea to use Mr. Mime when there's a better skill, Charge Strength M, for Mr. Mime to trigger. And Mr. Mime producing not even half of the amount of Golduck's Charge Strength productions. But that would almost be intuitive because Golduck is a skill specialist. So let's take away all the skill specialists by looking at only berry and ingredient specialists. And there we have it. Feraligatr is at the top. Mr. Mime in a team with Feraligatr would make Charge Strength S worse if the comparison is to have 2 Feraligatr as opposed to 1 Feraligatr and 1 Mr. Mime. I hope that makes sense. So basically, this is the cutoff, anything below which Mr. Mime will improve when it's on the team. Again, we're just looking at skill trigger here. And anything that's above Mr. Mime up here, well, having Mr. Mime on the team would worsen the overall skill production when the comparison is just having 2 of that species. I kind of simplified the scenario here by pretending there's only 2 Pokemon on the team. Regardless, if there's a Charge Strength M on the team, it just doesn't make sense for Mr. Mime to try and trigger Charge Strength S. But let's take a look at Charge Strength M, and here they are, including the skill specialist. You can see that Mr. Mime is actually at the top of all the non-skill specialists. So of course, Ampharos and Espeon being at the top, but if we remove skill specialists, and here we have it, Mr. Mime is actually the best at triggering Charge Strength M, and by a good amount as well. We're talking about a half to 1 whole trigger compared to its competitors. So let's say you have a team of 2 Quaquaval and 2 Houndoom and 1 Mr. Mime. Mr. Mime actually improves the overall situation with your skill triggers on Charge Strength M. And I'm going to try and not repeat myself from this point on, but basically anytime you see Mr. Mime at the top, it means Mr. Mime is improving the productions if the rest of the team have skill trigger rates below Mr. Mime. Next is Dream Shard Magnet. I've included both fixed and variable here. Again, mainly the skill specialist will beat Mr. Mime, and if we remove skill specialist, unfortunately there's only one other comparison, and that's Holiday Eevee, who is a berry specialist. And yes, Mr. Mime does beat Holiday Eevee, so theoretically if you have Dream Shard Magnet Holiday Eevee running on the team, and you put Mr. Mime on the team, then overall it will improve the skill productions. At this point, it's important to note that I'm talking as though all these Pokemon have the same skill level just to make sure the comparison is fair. But of course, it's no mystery that Mr. Mime actually beats out Eevee Holiday just a little bit more because it can evolve once, saving you one main skill seed. This is the ranking for Energizing Cheer. Once again, Mr. Mime is actually only beat by the skill specialists. This is after I removed all of the skill specialists, leaving only berry and ingredient specialists. And Mr. Mime is actually at the top. So if you use a full team of Energizing Cheer Pokemon like Comfey or Ninetales, having Mr. Mime on the team improves the skill trigger. Next is Charge Energy S, and I've included Umbreon's unique Moonlight Charge Energy S in this as well. Moonlight is a little bit different to regular Charge Energy S, which we won't go into detail today. And here's Mr. Mime. Now let's remove the skill specialists. And just to reduce the clutter, I'm only going to show Final Evolution. And for Charge Energy S, actually there's a lot of Pokemon that are better than Mr. Mime. Skeledirge, Tyranitar, Aggron, Arbok, Altaria, Klotzai, Victreebel, they all beat Mr. Mime in their self-healing. So in terms of amount of healing, having Mr. Mime on a team with these top Pokemon actually reduces your total skill recovery. But if you have Mr. Mime on a team with Marowak, Dragonite, Raticate, Dodrio, or Quagsire, then overall speaking, it would improve the team in regards to the self-healing. Of course, the skill trigger rate on Mr. Mime is the same no matter who it's teamed with. Regardless of the situation, it will heal exactly the same. Again, what I'm talking about is I'm comparing if I were to run 5 Marowak versus 4 Marowak and 1 Mr. Mime, which team would have in total more healing? And in this situation, it's the one with Mr. Mime. But the reverse is true if the team were comprised of these 7 Pokemon that are above Mr. Mime. For Energy for Everyone, all current Pokemon are skill specialists, so of course it's going to be very difficult to compare here because we're comparing different specialties, but we generally think of skill specialists as having about double the amount of skill triggers compared to berry or ingredient specialists. In that sense, have a look at Mr. Mime's numbers. At 3.17 triggers per day, with Wigglytuff only 3.45 a day and only outranked by Gardevoir at 4.1, it's actually a very good idea to have Mr. Mime on the team for some extra healing. Again, because we're comparing different specialties here, you have to think of it slightly differently. If Mr. Mime were a skill specialist for Energy for Everyone, as a rule of thumb, we think of Mr. Mime as having 6.3 triggers because we have to double this amount. So where it loses out on Energy for Everyone Healer because it's a bit less than Gardevoir, well, it's giving you tomatoes in return because it's not a skill specialist, it's an ingredient specialist. So make sure you understand that difference when we compare across specialties. So this is a very respectable number if it's in a team with an Energy for Everyone healer. In fact, so much so, if your current healer is Wigglytuff, Mr. Mime on the team is probably helping you quite a bit with the healing. The catch is, of course, Mr. Mime is actually an ingredient specialist and you probably haven't spent your main seed, so its skill level is fairly low. And because of that, you may not be seeing that much healing from Mr. Mime. But if you had invested it all the way to max level, it would be producing a very respectable amount of healing. This is Extra Helpful S. Mr. Mime is above Alola Ninetales by almost 1 whole trigger per day. It is only behind Skill Specialist for Extra Helpful S, so Mr. Mime is the best in the non-skill specialist category. Next is Ingredient Magnet S. Now this came as a surprise to me. Let's forget Slarking for a moment. I know it's a berry specialist that acts like a skill specialist, so it's an anomaly. Mr. Mime of course still produces 3.1 triggers per day, outranked by Vaporeon and Heracross, but again they are skill specialists. But besides that, it is actually at the top of the list. It is above Steelix, Charizard, Venusaur, and everyone else in Ingredient Magnet triggers. So in a team with Ingredient Magnet Pokemon, Mr. Mime is actually improving your Ingredient Magnet output. This is Cooking Power Up. Again, let's ignore the skill specialist. Mr. Mime is at the top of this list. above both Luxray and Meowscarada, both of which are ingredient specialists. In fact, Luxray is a very interesting comparison because both Mr. Mime and Luxray can do mono tomatoes. So if both Luxray and Mr. Mime are mono tomatoes and we're only comparing this skill trigger rate, Mr. Mime is actually overall better than Luxray. Where Mr. Mime loses out though is in its actual tomato productions. Luxray does produce more than Mr. Mime. Luxray produces about 8 to 9% more tomatoes than Mr. Mime, and Mr. Mime makes up for it by having more skill trigger. So if you had the choice between Luxray and Mr. Mime, well, it may simply depend on whether you want skill copy to trigger. So if you look at the rest of your team and everyone's running Charge Strength S, maybe you should run Luxray. But if the whole team were running, let's say, Energy for Everyone, Charge Strength M, and all the strong skills that you want Mr. Mime to copy, then Mr. Mime may be better than Luxray, as long as you don't need those 8 to 9% extra tomatoes. For Metronome, Mr. Mime just beats out Clefable by a little bit, and of course it loses out to Togekiss, the skill specialist. But otherwise, Mr. Mime is at the top for Metronome because, well, it only has one competitor, and that's Clefable. Next is Tasty Chance S. Now this one's interesting because Cramorant actually beats Mr. Mime. Cramorant being a newer Pokemon, having 16 bars to catch, it almost makes sense that it should be better than Mr. Mime. But Mr. Mime beats out Weavile in the Tasty Chance S triggers. This is for Stockpile, but again, the skill works a little differently, so it's not really worth comparing here, but just to let you guys know, Drifblim is well and truly above Mr. Mime in its Stockpile triggers. Disguise Berry Burst, now this one's a bit awkward. I believe you simply get the Berry Burst output, so that means there's no chance for a great success. So even though it looks like the skill triggers are very close between Mimikyu and Mr. Mime, the comparison here is a little bit more in depth, and I haven't dived into the numbers. If you guys are interested, we can take a look at this in another video. On the contrary, Braviary also has about the same trigger rate as Mr. Mime and Mimikyu in Berry Burst, but again, this is not Disguise Berry Burst. It is not known to have a great success chance. And so that's it. If I missed any skill, let me know. I think I covered everything here. So the take-home points are that if you use Mr. Mime in a team with strong skills, but otherwise normally those Pokemon have low trigger rate, then Mr. Mime or sometimes Ditto can improve the overall skill trigger productions. But if you're using skill copy in a team that otherwise produces weak skills that usually happen more often, then you're not going to see as much value. In the end, you still need to consider whether you need the ingredients that these Pokemon produce and whether you're going to actually invest your main seeds to make them worthwhile. Another take-home point is try not to run both skill copy Pokemon in the same team. Even if you need Leek or Tomato, try to run them separately because otherwise you're just getting a weak version of Charge Strength when skill copy fails to copy. And lastly, it can actually be worth spending your main skill seeds on one of these Pokemon if you've got a really good one that you use quite often. And the final comparison we want to look at is, well, for Psychic team building that you might want to consider for the Cresselia and Darkrai event. Of course, we don't have much information about that event at this stage, but let's take a look at all the Psychic Pokemon we have. Currently, the known ones are all skill specialists, so that means it's already not a fair comparison with Mr. Mime. But if we take the approach that a skill specialist doubles the amount of skill triggers than ingredient specialist, then Mr. Mime is doing pretty well at 3 triggers per day, farming your tomatoes at the same time. In a team with Espeon and Energy for Everyone healer that only triggers 4.2 or 4.1 times a day, Mr. Mime is actually helping you quite a bit, provided you need the tomatoes or the potatoes that it actually farms. Currently, we don't know what the stats for Musharno is, but that could change a few things once we know, because if it has a very nice skill, then Mr. Mime will be able to copy that in the Psychic team build. Thank you for watching, guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions in the comments section down below. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe.